Have you ever looked at an old family photograph and noticed something that shouldn't be there? Something that makes your skin crawl because you absolutely know, it wasn't there when the picture was taken. In 1910, the Henderson family gathered in their parlor for what they thought would be a simple portrait. Everyone accounted for, everyone in their place. But when the photograph came back from the developer, there were hands in the frame, hands that belonged to no one in that room. What you're about to hear is the documented account of what happened next, pieced together from letters, diary entries, and local newspaper archives. This isn't fiction. This is a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. If you're enjoying this kind of content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. The autumn wind carried the scent of burning leaves through the streets of Millbrook, Connecticut on October 3rd, 1910. Inside the Henderson residence at 47 Maple Street, the family was preparing for an event that happened perhaps once every few years. A formal family portrait. Margaret Henderson, the matriarch at 42 years old, had been planning this for months. Her husband Robert, a textile mill supervisor, had finally agreed to the expense. Their 3 children, Elizabeth, 16, Thomas, 14, and young Catherine, only 8, had been instructed to wear their Sunday best. The photographer, Mr. Ernest Whitmore, arrived promptly at 2 in the afternoon. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and meticulous habits, known throughout the county for his precision. He set up his camera equipment in the front parlor, where the light from the large bay windows would provide optimal illumination. "Everyone must remain perfectly still," Mr. Whitmore instructed, his voice carrying the authority of experience. "Even the slightest movement will blur the image. The exposure will take approximately 30 seconds. The family arranged themselves carefully. Robert stood behind Margaret, who sat in the upholstered chair that had belonged to her mother. Elizabeth and Thomas flanked their parents on either side, while little Catherine sat on a small stool at her mother's feet. The family dog, a terrier named Jasper, had been relegated to the backyard for the occasion. Margaret remembered the moment vividly, as she would later write in her diary. The parlor felt unusually cold despite the fire crackling in the hearth. She attributed it to nerves. Having one's portrait taken was still a relatively rare and formal affair. The children were remarkably well behaved, maintaining their poses with admirable discipline. Mr. Whitmore disappeared beneath the black cloth draped over his camera, his hand positioned on the shutter release. "On my count," he announced. 1, 2, 3. The shutter clicked, and for 30 long seconds, the Henderson family remained frozen in time. "Excellent," Mr. Whitmore declared, emerging from beneath the cloth. "I believe we have captured a fine image. The photograph will be ready for collection in 1 week." The family relaxed, and life resumed its normal rhythm. Margaret served tea and cake, the children returned to their afternoon activities, and Mr. Whitmore packed his equipment with the same precision he had demonstrated in its setup. No one noticed anything unusual. No one felt any presence beyond the 6 people who had been in that room. 7 days later, Robert Henderson walked to Mr. Whitmore's studio on Main Street to collect the finished portrait. The photographer greeted him with his usual professional courtesy and presented the photograph, mounted in a simple frame. "One of my finer works, if I may say so," Mr. Whitmore remarked. "The clarity is exceptional." Robert examined the portrait and agreed. Every detail was sharp, the pattern on Margaret's dress, the texture of the upholstery, even the individual threads in the carpet were visible. He paid the photographer, thanked him, and walked home with the framed portrait under his arm. It was Margaret who first noticed. That evening, as Robert hung the portrait above the mantelpiece in the parlor, Margaret stood back to admire it. The placement was perfect, centered above the fireplace, where it would be visible to anyone entering the room. But as she studied the image, her expression changed. "Robert," she said quietly, her voice tight, "look at Catherine's shoulders." Robert stepped down from the small ladder he'd been using and joined his wife. He looked where she indicated, and his breath caught. Behind young Catherine, resting on her small shoulders, were two hands. Adult hands. Pale hands with long, slender fingers. "Those are my hands," Margaret said immediately, but even as she spoke, she knew it was wrong. In the photograph, Margaret's hands were clearly visible, folded in her lap. These other hands, these extra hands, came from somewhere behind Catherine, emerging from the empty space between the child and her mother's chair. Robert's logical mind immediately sought rational explanations. "It must be a trick of the light," he suggested, "or perhaps a double exposure. Mr. Whitmore mentioned he'd photographed another family earlier that day, but Margaret shook her head slowly. The hands were too clear, too deliberate. They rested on Catherine's shoulders with an almost protective gesture. The fingers curled slightly as if they belonged there, as if whoever they belonged to had stood behind Catherine throughout the entire exposure. "We need to ask Mr. Whitmore about this," Robert said, though his voice lacked conviction. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about those hands, how natural they looked, how they seemed to cradle Catherine's shoulders with a gentleness that was almost loving. Almost. The next morning, Robert returned to Mr. Whitmore's studio, the portrait tucked carefully under his arm. The photographer was preparing for another session when Robert entered, and his professional smile faltered when he saw the expression on Robert's face. "Mr. Henderson, is something wrong with the portrait? I need you to look at something," Robert said, unwrapping the photograph and placing it on the counter. Mr. Whitmore adjusted his spectacles and leaned close to examine the image. His confidence wavered as he studied the hands behind Catherine. His finger traced the air above the photograph, not quite touching it, as if afraid of what he was seeing. "This is impossible," Mr. Whitmore whispered. "I was there. I set up the shot. There were only 5 people in that room." "Could it be a double exposure?" Robert asked, grasping for rationality. "Could another image have somehow—" "No." Mr. Whitmore's interruption was sharp. "I use fresh plates for every session. This plate had never been exposed before your family's portrait. And look," he pointed to the hands. "The focus is identical to the rest of the image. If this were a double exposure, there would be ghosting, transparency. These hands are as solid and clear as your own." The two men stared at the photograph in silence. The autumn sunlight streaming through the studio window seemed to dim, as if a cloud had passed over the sun. If you're enjoying this story so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. "I've been a photographer for 23 years, Mr. Whitmore said quietly. "I've seen technical errors, chemical accidents, damaged plates. This is none of those things. These hands—" He paused, removing his spectacles to clean them, a nervous gesture. "These hands were there when I took the photograph. They were in your parlor." Robert felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "That's impossible. We would have seen them." "Would you?" Mr. Whitmore replaced his spectacles. "The camera sees things the human eye sometimes misses. Light frequencies, shadows, moments frozen that the eye interprets differently." He hesitated. "Mr. Henderson, has anything unusual happened in your home? Anything unexplained?" Robert wanted to say no. He wanted to dismiss the question as superstitious nonsense. But he thought about the cold spots Margaret had mentioned, the way doors sometimes opened on windless days, the feeling, just a feeling, nothing concrete, that they were not always alone in the house. "Nothing we couldn't explain," Robert said finally, but the words felt hollow. He took the portrait home and showed it to Margaret. Together, they made a decision that would change everything. They would ask the children if they had noticed anything unusual. Elizabeth, their eldest, looked at the photograph with the critical eye of a 16-year-old. "They look like women's hands," she observed. "The fingers are delicate, and look at the nails. They're well-kept, not working hands." Thomas, ever practical, suggested they measure. "If we know where the hands are in the photograph, we can measure how tall the person would have to be to rest their hands on Catherine's shoulders like that." They conducted the experiment that evening. Catherine stood in the exact spot she'd occupied during the portrait while Thomas measured. The person, the entity, would have had to be approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, standing directly behind the child. "Was anyone standing behind me?" Catherine asked, her voice small. At 8 years old, she didn't fully understand the implications, but she could sense her parents' anxiety. "No, sweetheart," Margaret assured her. "No one was standing behind you." But that night, Margaret wrote in her diary, Catherine says she felt warm during the portrait. She says she felt safe, like someone was watching over her. She didn't tell us at the time because she thought it was just Mother standing close. But I was seated. I never stood behind her. Who made my daughter feel safe? Who put their hands on her shoulders? Robert decided to research the history of the house. Built in 1847, it had been home to 3 families before the Hendersons purchased it in 1905. The previous owners, the Thorntons, had lived there for 40 years until old Mr. Thornton passed away. Robert visited the county records office and discovered something that made his blood run cold. In 1873, the Thorntons had a daughter named Sarah who died at age 23 from pneumonia. According to the death certificate, Sarah Thornton was 5 feet 6 inches tall. She had never married, had worked as a seamstress, and was known for her gentle disposition and love of children. Robert told Margaret that night, and they both looked again at the hands in the photograph. Seamstress hands, gentle hands, hands that had spent years working with delicate fabrics and fine needles. "It can't be," Margaret whispered, but her conviction was fading. The next day they visited the town cemetery. Sarah Thornton's grave was modest, marked by a simple headstone. Sarah Louise Thornton, 1850-1873, beloved daughter. Fresh flowers sat in a vase by the stone, though the cemetery keeper couldn't say who had left them. As they stood by the grave, a wind rustled through the cemetery trees, carrying leaves that settled gently on the stone. Margaret felt that same cold sensation from the day of the portrait, not threatening, not malevolent, but present, definitely present. "Why would she come back?" Robert asked, speaking to the grave as if Sarah might answer. "Why would she be in our home?" They had no answer. But that night, sleeping fitfully, Margaret dreamed of a young woman in 1870s dress, standing in their parlor, watching the children play with a sad, wistful smile. The discovery of Sarah Thornton's history should have provided closure, a rational explanation for the inexplicable hands in the photograph. Instead, it opened a door that could not be closed. The Henderson family became acutely aware of their home in ways they had never been before. It started with small things. Margaret would find her sewing box moved to different locations, always somewhere she could easily find it, as if someone was tidying up after her. The children's toys would be arranged neatly in the morning, even though they'd been left scattered the night before. Books would appear on the parlor table, volumes about Connecticut history, about the town's past, about families who had lived and died in Millbrook. "Maybe we're just forgetting we put things away," Robert suggested, but even he didn't sound convinced. Elizabeth began keeping a journal of the occurrences, applying the observational skills her teachers praised in school. Her entries were precise and unsettling. October 18th, 1910. Found Mother's wedding photograph moved from the bedroom mantel to the parlor table. Mother swears she didn't move it. The photograph shows Mother at age 23, the same age Sarah Thornton was when she died. October 22nd, 1910. Catherine's doll was positioned in the rocking chair in her room, wrapped in a small blanket we've never seen before. The blanket is old, the fabric worn. Catherine says she woke in the night and felt someone tucking her in, but thought it was Mother. Mother was asleep in her own room. October 29th, 1910. The smell of lavender fills the house, though we have no lavender. Father checked the garden, the cabinets, everywhere. The scent is strongest near Catherine's room and in the parlor where the portrait was taken. Leave a comment below about what you think of this story so far. Thomas, more skeptical than his sister, set up what he called experiments. He would leave objects in specific positions and check them in the morning. A book placed at a certain angle on a shelf. A chair positioned exactly 3 inches from the wall. A coin balanced on its edge on the mantelpiece. Most mornings, nothing changed. But some mornings, the book would be opened to a specific page. Always passages about family, about home, about belonging. The chair would be moved closer to the window, as if someone wanted to sit and watch the street. The coin would be found placed carefully inside the family Bible, marking passages about remembrance and eternal rest. "She's trying to communicate," Elizabeth said one evening as the family gathered in the parlor. The portrait hung above them, those mysterious hands forever frozen in their protective gesture on Catherine's shoulders. "We don't know that it's a she," Robert countered. Though he'd seen the evidence, read his daughter's journal, noticed the same patterns. "The hands are a woman's hands," Margaret said quietly, "and everything that happens, it feels feminine, gentle, like someone taking care of a home." That night, Margaret did something she'd been contemplating for weeks. She sat alone in the parlor after the family had gone to bed, a candle burning on the table beside her, and she spoke aloud to the empty room. "Sarah? Sarah Thornton, if that's who you are, we mean you no harm. This was your home once. We know you lived here. We know you died young." She paused, feeling foolish, but pressing on. "If you're trying to tell us something, we're listening." The candle flame flickered, though there was no draught. The air grew colder, and Margaret pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, deliberately, the pages of the family Bible on the shelf began to turn by themselves. Margaret's heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't run. She stood and approached the Bible, watching as the pages settled on the book of Ruth. Her eyes fell to verse 16. "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay." Tears blurred Margaret's vision. She understood now. Sarah Thornton hadn't left her home. Even in death, she'd remained in the place she'd loved, the place where she'd lived out her short life. And now, another family occupied that space. A family with children who needed watching, a home that needed caring for. "You never left," Margaret whispered. "You've been here all along." The temperature in the room slowly returned to normal. The candle flame steadied. Margaret felt a presence, not threatening, not frightening, but sad. Deeply, profoundly sad. She began visiting Sarah's grave regularly, bringing flowers, speaking to the headstone as if Sarah could hear. She told Sarah about the children, about their daily lives, about the small joys and concerns of running a household. And at home, the occurrences continued, but they took on a different character. Catherine began having dreams. Pleasant dreams where a kind lady in old-fashioned dress would read her stories and brush her hair. The child would wake refreshed, peaceful, and would tell her mother about the nice lady who visited at night. Elizabeth's journal entries shifted in tone. November 10th, 1910. I left my arithmetic homework on the table, struggling with a particularly difficult problem. This morning the page was turned to the answer key in my textbook, and the solution was circled lightly in pencil. Someone helped me. November 17th, 1910. Mother has stopped being afraid. She says Sarah is part of our family now, just a part we can't see. I think I understand what she means. The house feels full, not empty, not haunted in the scary way, just occupied. Robert remained skeptical but couldn't deny the patterns. His practical mind struggled with what his senses told him. One evening he sat in his study going over mill accounts, the stress of financial responsibilities weighing heavily. He stepped out for just a moment to get a glass of water, and when he returned, his ledger was open to an error he'd made 3 columns back, an error that would have cost him significantly if undetected. The mistake was circled in the same light pencil mark that had appeared in Elizabeth's homework. "Thank you," he said to the empty room, feeling absurd, but meaning it. The winter of 1910 approached, and the Henderson home settled into an unusual rhythm. A family of 5 living alongside something, someone they couldn't see but could no longer deny. The portrait remained above the mantelpiece. Those mysterious hands, a constant reminder that their home held more than met the eye. But not everyone in Millbrook was as accepting as the Hendersons would become. News of the Hendersons' unusual photograph had spread through Millbrook, despite the family's attempts at discretion. Mr. Whitmore, unable to explain the phenomenon photographically, had mentioned it to a colleague. That colleague had told his wife. The wife had told her sister. By December 1910, the story of the ghost hands had become common gossip in the small Connecticut town. The reaction was mixed. Some neighbors crossed the street rather than pass directly by 47 Maple Street. Others knocked on the door with morbid curiosity, hoping to see the infamous portrait. The local minister, Reverend Samuel Clark, paid a visit one cold December afternoon. "Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Henderson," he began, seated uncomfortably in the very parlor where the photograph had been taken. His eyes kept drifting to the portrait above the mantelpiece. "There's been talk, concerning talk. We're aware," Robert said evenly. "The church has a position on such matters," Reverend Clark continued. "Spirits of the dead should be at rest. If something lingers here, it's unnatural. Unholy, even." Margaret's back stiffened. "With respect, Reverend, nothing unholy has occurred in this house. No harm has come to us. Quite the opposite. We've felt protected." "That's precisely the danger," the Reverend argued. "The devil can disguise himself as an angel of light. What seems benevolent may be a deception." The debate continued for an hour, with the Reverend advocating for an exorcism, a cleansing of the house, prayer sessions to drive out whatever presence had made itself known. The Hendersons listened politely, but remained unconvinced. "She lived here," Margaret finally said. "Sarah Thornton lived in this house for most of her life. She died young, before she could marry, before she could have children of her own. If she's remained, if she watches over us, I can't see the harm in that." After the Reverend left, unsuccessful in his mission, the Hendersons gathered in the parlor. The children had heard everything from the staircase where they'd been listening. "Are we in danger?" Catherine asked, her 8-year-old face serious. Robert picked up his youngest daughter and held her. "No, sweetheart, we're not in danger." "Then why did the Reverend say those things?" It was Elizabeth who answered, her 16-year-old wisdom beyond her years. "Because people fear what they don't understand, and they want clear answers, good or evil, holy or unholy. They can't accept that maybe it's neither. Maybe it's just sad." Thomas added his own observation. "The Reverend never asked what we've experienced. He just told us what we should think. That's not how investigation works. That's not how truth works." That night, Margaret sat alone in the parlor again. She'd made it a habit now, these quiet conversations with Sarah, or with the empty air. She could never be quite sure. "They want me to make you leave," Margaret said softly. "They think you're dangerous, but I don't believe that. I think you're just here. You've always been here, and maybe that's all right." The temperature dropped, that familiar chill that signaled Sarah's presence. Margaret no longer found it frightening. The pages of the Bible turned again, this time to Ecclesiastes. "There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens." "Is it not your time yet?" Margaret asked. "Is that why you're still here?" No answer came, not in words, but Margaret felt something she could only describe as sadness, mixed with gratitude. Sarah wasn't ready to leave. Perhaps she never would be. And the Hendersons had to decide if they could live with that. The decision came to a head just before Christmas. Robert's mother, visiting from Boston, stayed for a week and experienced the phenomena firsthand. A staunch Presbyterian with no tolerance for supernatural nonsense, she witnessed her own belongings rearranged, smelled the phantom lavender, and woke one night to see, or believed she saw, a figure in old-fashioned dress standing by the window. She left 2 days early. "That house is possessed," she told Robert before departing. You need to move your family before something terrible happens. Mother, we've lived here for 5 years. And how long have these occurrences been happening? How long has that thing been in your home? Robert had no answer. They didn't know how long Sarah had been making herself known, subtly, quietly, in ways they'd overlooked or rationalized until the photograph had made her presence undeniable. That evening, the family held a meeting. Democracy, Robert believed, should extend to household decisions. "We need to decide," he said, looking at each family member. "Do we stay, knowing what we know, or do we sell the house and move?" Catherine spoke first. "The nice lady isn't mean. She helps me when I'm scared at night." Thomas, pragmatic as always, laid out the facts. "Nothing bad has happened. The occurrences are benign. And honestly, I'd like to study this further. This is a scientific anomaly." Elizabeth looked at the portrait, at those hands on her sister's shoulders. "She watches over us. I don't think she means harm. I think she's lonely." All eyes turned to Margaret, who'd been silent. She stood and walked to the mantelpiece, touching the frame of the portrait gently. "When I was Catherine's age," Margaret began, "my own mother died. I remember feeling unanchored, like I might float away without her there to hold me to earth. If Sarah Thornton watches over our children, if she tends our home, if she remains because she loves this place," she turned to face her family, "then I say she's welcome to stay." Robert nodded slowly. "Then it's decided. We stay." If you enjoyed this video, leave a comment and subscribe. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss future videos. Christmas 1910 arrived with heavy snow blanketing Millbrook, Connecticut. The Henderson house glowed with candlelight and warmth, a beacon on Maple Street, despite, or perhaps because of, the rumors that surrounded it. Margaret had decorated with her usual care, greenery adorning the mantelpiece, stockings hung below the portrait that had started everything. On Christmas Eve, after the children had been tucked into bed, Robert and Margaret stood in the parlor admiring their work. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The portrait above the mantelpiece seemed almost alive in the flickering light. Those mysterious hands, a permanent reminder of their unseen housemate. "Do you think she celebrates Christmas?" Margaret asked softly. Robert put his arm around his wife. "I don't know. I don't know what she does, what she thinks, if she thinks at all in the way we understand thinking." He paused. "But if she's here, if she's been here all these months watching over us, then perhaps she's celebrating with us." Margaret had left a small wrapped package on the mantelpiece earlier that day, a gesture that felt right, even if it seemed foolish. Inside was a simple handkerchief she'd embroidered with Sarah's initials, SLT. It would never be opened, she knew, but the gesture mattered. In the morning, the children woke to find their stockings filled, presents under the small tree in the parlor. But Catherine discovered something extra, a small cloth doll, old-fashioned in design, sitting in her stocking. It wasn't something Robert or Margaret had purchased. The doll wore a dress from the 1870s, expertly sewn with tiny, precise stitches. "The nice lady left this for me," Catherine announced with absolute certainty. Elizabeth examined the doll closely. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the kind of work that took hours of skilled labor, the kind of work a seamstress might produce. "Thank you, Sarah," Catherine said to the room at large, hugging the doll. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. This was real. Whatever Sarah Thornton was, wherever she existed between life and death, she was real, and she was here, and she cared for them. The winter passed into spring. Life continued its rhythm at 47 Maple Street. The occurrences became normal, expected even. The scent of lavender that signaled Sarah's presence, the helpful tidying, the books left open to relevant passages, the gentle protection over the children. Thomas conducted his experiments throughout the spring, documenting everything with scientific precision. He wrote a paper for school about unexplained phenomena and psychological perception, carefully avoiding mentioning his own home directly. His teacher gave him top marks and commented that he had the mind of a researcher. Elizabeth's journal continued, no longer with alarm, but with affection. April 3rd, 1911. Sarah moved my slippers closer to my bed last night. It's been cold, and I'd forgotten to place them near. She's more attentive than I am sometimes. May 17th, 1911. Mother was ill with a terrible headache. A cool compress appeared on her nightstand, perfectly folded. Father was at work, and we children were at school. Sarah takes care of us when we need it. Robert's skepticism had evolved into something more complex. Not quite belief, but acceptance. He couldn't explain what happened in his home, but he could no longer deny it. He told Margaret one evening that he'd made peace with not understanding. Maybe some things aren't meant to be fully understood, he said. Maybe some mysteries exist in the space between what we can prove and what we can know. Margaret had become Sarah's advocate among the neighbors. When gossip circulated, when fearful whispers suggested the house was cursed, Margaret would calmly explain their experience. Most people didn't believe her. Some thought the family had succumbed to mass delusion. A very few, listened with open minds. One of those was Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, an elderly woman who'd lived in Millbrook all her life. She visited one afternoon in June, asking to see the famous photograph. Margaret showed her, and Mrs. Pritchard studied it for a long time. "I knew Sarah Thornton," she finally said. "We were girls together. She was kind, gentle, and she loved children. Always said she wanted a big family someday." Mrs. Pritchard's eyes were distant with memory. When she died, it broke her parents' hearts. They sold the house within a year. Couldn't bear to be here without her. "But she never left," Margaret said softly. "No," Mrs. Pritchard agreed. "I don't suppose she did. This was her home. Some people are so attached to a place that even death can't sever that connection." She looked at Margaret with understanding eyes. "You've given her something her parents couldn't. Acceptance. You've let her stay." Summer arrived with warmth and long golden evenings. Catherine played in the yard with her doll, the one Sarah had given her. Sometimes she would talk to the air, having conversations with someone no one else could see. Margaret watched from the window, no longer concerned. Thomas graduated from his experiments to philosophical questions. If Sarah Thornton is here, conscious and aware, does that prove an afterlife? Does it prove that consciousness survives death? And if it does, what does that mean for all of us? Robert had no answers to his son's questions. Neither did Margaret. But they continued their life at 47 Maple Street, sharing their home with a presence they couldn't explain. The photograph remained above the mantelpiece, those hands forever protecting Catherine in that frozen moment from 1910. Visitors would sometimes ask about it, and the Hendersons would tell the truth, or as much of it as they understood. Years would pass. The children would grow up. Catherine would eventually move away, taking the old-fashioned doll with her. Thomas would become a scientist, his childhood experiences fueling a lifelong interest in the unexplained. Elizabeth would become a writer, penning stories about the thin veil between the living and the dead. Robert and Margaret would grow old in that house on Maple Street, and they would never be alone. On quiet nights they would still smell lavender. Books would still open to meaningful passages. The house would still feel tended, cared for, loved by someone whose investment in it transcended death. They never discovered a definitive answer to what Sarah Thornton was: spirit, ghost, energy, consciousness, or something beyond their understanding. The photograph provided evidence of her presence, but no explanation for it. The phenomena continued, but never intensified, never became threatening, never demanded more than acceptance. In the end, the Henderson family learned to live with mystery. They learned that not every question has an answer, not every phenomenon has an explanation, and not every presence has to be feared. The hands in the photograph remained exactly as they were, protective, gentle, eternal. A reminder that some people love a place so deeply that they never truly leave it. And sometimes, if you're fortunate, they watch over those who come after with the same devotion they showed in life. Sarah Thornton had been dead for 37 years when the photograph was taken, But in some way, that transcended understanding. She had never left 47 Maple Street. She was there when the Hendersons arrived. She was there throughout their years in the house. And long after they eventually moved on, those who lived thereafter would report the same phenomena: the lavender scent, the tidying, the protective presence. The mystery was never solved because perhaps it wasn't meant to be. Perhaps some questions exist not to be answered, but to remind us that reality contains more than what we can measure, photograph, or explain. The hands in the 1910 portrait remain one of the unexplained mysteries of Millbrook, Connecticut, evidence of something that shouldn't exist according to logic, yet undeniably present in that frozen moment of time. And somewhere, in a way we cannot comprehend, Sarah Thornton continues to care for the home she loved, watching over those who live within its walls, her hands forever reaching out to protect and comfort, visible only through the eye of a camera, but felt by those willing to sense her presence. The Henderson family kept the photograph for the rest of their lives. When Margaret Henderson passed away in 1954, the portrait went to Catherine, who kept it until her own death in 1989. It now resides in the Millbrook Historical Society, where it continues to perplex and fascinate visitors who study those inexplicable hands and wonder about the woman who left them there. Was it Sarah Thornton? Was it a trick of light, chemistry, and timing that will never be replicated? Was it mass delusion by a family desperate to explain the unexplainable? We'll never know for certain. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be. If you enjoyed this video, leave a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing your opinions and answering your questions. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future videos. There are more mysteries waiting to be explored, more stories that blur the line between what we know and what we can only wonder about. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, sometimes the most interesting answers are the ones we never quite find.